Nature's Archive podcast, a Jumpstart Nature production.
When I think of the ocean, it's almost like a book. The cover of the book or the surface of the ocean prevents you from seeing inside. There's a title, The Ocean, which gives us a hint about what it is. We probably have some preconceived ideas. When you're looking at a book, you can see the graphics or the author and maybe derive a little bit of knowledge. But we can't really see inside to truly understand the stories that it wants to tell. And one of those stories is about a forest. Yes, there's an underwater forest that serves multiple critical purposes for life on Earth. And I'm talking about kelp forests. They generate oxygen, store carbon, balance chemical cycles critical for life, and they support amazingly biodiverse habitats. But kelp are in trouble. In fact, 96% of the kelp forests in today's guest region have disappeared in just a few years. And the reasons are multiple and the solutions, unfortunately, are unclear. And that guest I mentioned is Tristin Anoush McHugh, and she's the Kelp Project Director for the Nature Conservancy in California. I knew I had to meet Tristin after seeing a wonderful short film called Forest Above and Forest Below. It was written and narrated by Tristin, and it's a powerful 6-minute film. Check the show notes for a link. It's on YouTube. And Tristin didn't disappoint. Today, she helps us understand what kelp are and why they're in trouble. We discuss the complex relationships they have with other amazing creatures like sea otters, purple urchins, and sunflower sea stars. And speaking of sea stars, we also discuss the dramatic impacts of sea star wasting disease, as well as how warming oceans might be disrupting kelp's ability to reproduce. I found this conversation to be incredibly enlightening and extremely important. Oceans are disproportionately important, in fact, for our climate and life in general. Yet we all too often keep that proverbial book that I mentioned closed up and sitting on the shelf. So let's open it up today, and without further delay, Tristin Anoush McHugh. Tristin, thank you so much for carving out some time for me today. I'm really looking forward to learning a bit about kelp.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
The reason I reached out, and we've been talking about this already, so you know this, but for the audience, I attended this fun short film festival that was put on by the Peninsula Open Space Trust here in the Bay Area. And one of the films was called Forest Above and Forest Below. And I was so inspired by it that I knew I had to do an episode on kelp, and I wanted to find the people who made this film specifically. And I looked at the credits and I found you. So here we are today.
That's such a cool finding story. I haven't had that one yet, so that's a good one. I like it.
And I'm going to share that link too, by the way, in the show notes so people can see. It's 6.5 minutes or 6 minutes or so. It's definitely worth a watch. So let's just jump straight in. What is kelp?
Yeah, that is a great starting question. Kelp is an organism and a habitat. Kelp in itself is a photosynthesizing organism like a tree, but it's underwater. So it creates this beautiful dimensional structure that many organisms use for food, habitat, and shelter.
When we're thinking taxonomy and the tree of life, where is kelp in that picture?
Yeah, when we think about the tree of life, kelp and seaweeds, algae are some of the most early on organisms that ever inhabited this planet, right? They are truly the foundational species to which all life depends on, frankly. And they're very diverse as well.
So it's a type of algae?
Yes, kelp is actually a subset of algae, right? So we have, I would say in layman's terms, like microalgae, and you can think of those as your little tiny phytoplankton, like other small photosynthesizing organisms. And then you have macroalgae, which we think of as the ones that you can generally see with your eyes. And within that macroalgae category, there are actually these 3 kind of functional groups within that. There's the brown algae, which are kelps, like the true kelps. There's red algae, and then there's green algae. And so each of those have their own thing going on in terms of what they do, how they reproduce, and all of that. But really, when we say seaweed, we're encompassing all of that. When we say kelp, we're only really talking about brown algae.
And I'm just going to assume I've learned a bit from past guests when we talk about common names like brown algae or red algae, that they aren't always going to be brown. They aren't always going to be red.
That's right. Yeah, that is, it actually comes down to most of their pigmentation too. Each of these types of algae have their own types of pigmentation to them, which further classify them into those genera, among other things, of course. But to the eye, no, most red algae actually looks pretty brown. And then brown algae often looks pretty brown, but also green and red. It's pretty mixed. But really what it comes down to is when you're looking at these organisms, you can tell functionally and morphologically, they look quite in their category.
Got it. And for people like me who haven't had the opportunity to go diving and really observing from beneath the surface of the ocean what kelp look like and a kelp forest looks like, can you help paint a picture of, like, we can focus on your area. You're in Northern California, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I'm based in the Mendocino Coast.
So what does it look like? How, when you experience a kelp forest, can you just help us understand what it is that you're seeing?
Taking a step back, like when we're talking about where a kelp forest is, we're talking about these cold, temperate reef areas, right? California in itself, as opposed to a coral reef system, we have a temperate reef system. So at its foundation, we have rock, and then building upon that rock is everything else that attaches to it, like kelp, right?
Interrupting for a second, I just wanted to explain what a reef is because it took me a while to really understand the full scope. We often hear of coral reefs, but there are other types of reefs. So the definition that I found basically says a reef is a system of ridges that rise near the surface of the ocean. So very often they'll be near a coastline. And these ridges could be rocks, they could be sand, they could be coral, or a number of other things.
And so there's no root structure, but what you get is this organism with a holdfast that almost looks like a root system, but it's physically anchoring itself to the sea floor. And then from that holdfast, you have a stipe, which is like a trunk. Think of a tree trunk that extends upward to, and when I'm talking about kelp canopies, a canopy forming species like bull kelp or giant kelp, we're talking about them extending all the way from the seafloor to the surface of the ocean. And then from there, they create these very rich, beautiful canopy structures that trestle down, sunlight's coming through them, and they're gorgeous, right? We're talking about these beautiful underwater trees. And then that's just the canopy, right? When you go back down to the seafloor, then that's when you get those smaller, sometimes also smaller kelps, but then also your red algae, your green algae. You have your corallins, then you have your anemones attached to the seafloor and sea stars cruising around and some urchin, right? It's like you have this whole ecosystem right before you in a way that does parallel terrestrial forests. You can think about that understory I just told you about, like ferns, right? Ferns or bushes or grasses and flowers. Like we have that same sort of general structure underwater.
Presumably then there are various species living in this system that specialize in that understory or maybe in the midstory or the canopy?
That's exactly right. So based on the organisms itself, if you were just to take a snapshot and look out, you would see diving birds, pelagic birds just diving in the ocean. You're going to see little fish. You're going to see those benthic creatures like the sea stars, like the urchin cruising on the seafloor, and then harbor seals. And I've heard whales before. It's just a beautiful environment.
I wish I could experience it. And I might ask you either as part of this interview or after the fact for some resources, some pointers, videos, and things like that, in addition to the film that I mentioned before that I could share so people could really experience it as best they can through the computer screen anyway.
Yeah, that's fair. I think with those visuals, it's really hard to describe, but really I do implore people to just, right now I'm looking outside my backyard and I see trees, I see the bushes, like I can almost replace them with some of the things that I see underwater. And I conceptualize it in that way as well. So I just do implore you to think about like a terrestrial forest and those same functional groups. You could almost replace, put water in it, and that's generally what you get.
Yeah, and then you have that kind of magical swaying of everything as the water is moving, as the tides and the surface waves and everything else are affecting the life.
And yourself, right? You're a visitor in that system and everything knows it, you know it. And when you pause for a second, I've been underwater before and just, you're not supposed to hold your breath when you're scuba diving, but when you just take a quick pause and listen, you can actually hear the cracking of shrimp and other organisms living in that system. It's very dynamic. It's very rich. And it's also, depending on the time of day that you're diving too, the sunlight also alters the way that organisms behave with each other and among each other. So it's quite beautiful to be under there and just experience it.
So now that we have just a tiny taste of kelp, I I want to step back and learn a little bit about you and how you found your way to studying kelp. So let's go way back, actually. Have you always been interested in nature?
Yes, for sure. My brother and I would just spend so much time outside. And fortunately, my parents really encouraged that. And I think I was always fascinated by water, specifically anything that creeks, rivers, lakes, ocean. There was something about being in that medium that was just serene, tranquil, spiritual, that I just fell in love with water itself.
Did you grow up around water?
Yes and no. I grew up like East Bay area, if you know where Mount Diablo is, or,
Oh, yes.
Yeah, at the foothills of Mount Diablo. I grew up there and spent a lot of time visiting the ocean and never wanting to leave.
So you had some affinity for water and you were near the ocean, not on the ocean. What was the next step then to get you into oceanic research and kelp specifically?
That's a good question. So I think I knew at a young age, I was just like so in love with water. But then around high school, I took a marine biology course at my high school, and I just knew that there was something like I just couldn't put the books down. I couldn't stop looking at it, couldn't stop thinking about it. And it just consumed me. I wanted to know everything about this place. And it wasn't even about kelp at the time. It was about that big charismatic megafauna, the dolphins, the whales, the gateway animals. And yeah, I just never shook it. And I ended up applying to UC Santa Cruz for marine biology. And I was accepted and started there the following fall. And it just went from there. Just never really stopped thinking about it, working on it, and just really immersed myself in the literature. And it wasn't until towards the end of my college career that I started really scuba diving. And that was when I really tipped over into kelp, because that is what we live right next to, and that's where we were diving.
You mentioned the gateway animals, the megafauna that started you on this pathway. Did you have any experiences that really hooked you? It seemed like the gravitational pull was taking you there, but I'm curious if there was one day where you're like, yes, this is the system. These are the organisms that I'm going to spend the next X number of years with.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I was in college, I would say I was like speed dating a lot of different types of marine biology, right? I was considering like deep sea, thinking about dolphins still, and just like the way that their physiology allows them to dive for long periods of time. That's fascinating. I worked in the pinniped, which are like your seals and sea lions, pinniped cognition and sensory systems, like that excited me. But when I went scuba diving in Monterey, that was the first time I got to be underwater in my backyard. That is like California. That is our underwater backyard. And I got to do that. And I looked around and was like, what is this? How did I not know this was here? Oh, it was just like mind blowing. And so the diving, I think just being able to immerse myself in that system silently, you don't have to like talk to other people about the experience. You're just like in your own experience in a lot of ways. It was that moment that I looked around and was like, wow, this is something. And it just hooked me from there.
Yeah, I could almost imagine it being a little bit like you hear about people that go in those sensory deprivation tanks. But in this case, you have a few senses that are deprived when you're scuba diving, but then other ones then get excited and amplified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I just remember like one specific moment. I remember going out for like my first dive in cold water, and I was nervous about all the things on my gear and just all the stuff I had to remember. And then it just came naturally, right? You're like descending. And I remember looking up and seeing this like beautiful sunlight coming through the top of the giant kelp canopy. And then seeing these young of the year rockfish, like these teeny tiny little fish, like darting through the canopy. And that it blew my mind. It was unlike anything I had seen before. So that was like one experience that just tipped me into that sphere that I've never left.
Hey, nature enthusiast, do you want to be part of something bigger? Well, we're building a movement at Jumpstart Nature, and we've just added some new volunteers to help with our podcast and website. But this means our costs are going up too. I need to purchase software licenses to give them access to the production tools we use. For example, one media editing license costs $21 a month. And this is where you come in. please consider supporting our mission by contributing to Jumpstart Nature through our Patreon or direct contributions, or even purchasing some logo merch. Check out all these options at jumpstartnature.com/donate, also linked in the show notes. Not ready to make a financial contribution? Then please share this episode with 3 friends. Sharing what we do is actually one of the very best ways you can help us. Thank you all for your continued support. Yeah, and I guess where I'm struggling at the moment and where we go in this conversation is there's the big picture of this system and everything it does and how it's all interconnected and interlinked. And then there are some of the specifics about it, and maybe a way to balance that as we get in deeper into kelp life cycle and everything else is, I think a lot of people are familiar with sea otters and the relationship that sea otters have with the kelp system. So maybe we can start there. Can you tell me a little bit about that relationship, about what sea otters and kelp do together?
Yeah. So sea otters and kelp, I think because we see sea otters on the surface of the ocean and they're really cute and adorable, we kind of gravitate towards that relationship between that floating mammal on top of this kelp. But really, the otter is an organism that interacts in a kelp forest similar to the seals and sea lions. And their role is as an apex predator. And so they have this foundational role in kelp forest ecosystems, similar to that of sunflower sea stars in a way, where they have a disproportionately strong impact on a system. And so to further that point, what we know about otters is that they are really great hunters and they eat a lot of food, right? And by eating a lot of food, they serve as a almost moderator in the type of food items they eat. And one that they eat in particular, sometimes, depending, is a urchin, right? And so when I think of interest, especially now, is the way that sea otter, urchin, and kelp forests interact with each other and how those strings pull on each other.
For those who have not experienced urchins, can you tell me a little bit? Because I think we're going to talk more about urchins throughout the course of this discussion. Yeah. But what does an urchin look like, and what's their body plan, and what are they doing?
What are they doing? Yeah, urchin are probably one of the most impressive organisms in the world, I would say. There are hundreds of species all over the world. And in California, we have, I think, up to 4 species, but 2 predominant species. One is, and they're both native to these waters. One is the red sea urchin, which is a bit bigger, and the purple sea urchin, which is a bit smaller. But all urchin kind of follow the same body type generally. So think about an urchin as an organism that is small, rounded, has a rounded top body, and then lots of spines sticking off the back, almost like a pin cushion. If you want to think about a pin cushion, that's basically an urchin. And they have their mouth at the bottom. And by bottom, like they're going to be cruising around the sea floor where rocks are. Their mouth is on the bottom there, and they broadcast spawn. And so they need to be close enough to each other for them to spawn. They have a larval stage where their spawn goes out into the open ocean, comes back to shore, feels turbulence, and then they settle. And so they're an invertebrate, and they're highly effective. They're a very efficient, very robust, very resilient organism that is known to be like a habitat or ecosystem indicator, whether or not like their presence or abundance is shown.
And beneath all those spines, do they have a hard shell, or what's going on there?
Yeah, beneath their spines, they have this hard calcium carbonate shell. When you pick them up, they're spiky. And then they also have these little tube feet that come off and little pincers as well. So they have, if you looked at one, you'd almost see like angel hair pasta coming off of them, like in between the spines. But this more, I'm talking about a purple urchin, like this rosy purple color. I think they're quite beautiful, frankly.
Let's now put some pieces together a little bit more fully, I suppose. We're talking a bit here about West Coast. And as I understand it, though, there are kelp all around the globe. Well, first of all, is that accurate? Are there really kelp everywhere? And then how are those systems similar, maybe different species, but similar in their function and how they look?
Yeah, this is what blew my mind personally, was just thinking about like the renaissance that kelp is having right now and our global acknowledgement of where they operate, right? We know corals are in tropical places, right? Because typically those are the places people go to and they can get in the water somewhat comfortably and see them, right? We see that clear water and we can see corals. And they're all over the world. Think about that same premise applying to cold water places. So when you go somewhere where it's like greenish water, turbid, and you're questioning if you're going to get in the water because of the temperature, chances are that is a place where kelp and kelp ecosystems or algae systems can persist. And kelp is found all over the world, these ecosystems, but they're highly vulnerable in ways that we are just starting to understand. All over the world, we're experiencing habitat loss with corals, with mangroves, with these other systems. And that includes kelp forest ecosystems as well.
I think one thing that would help me as I seek to understand these systems a little bit more, you mentioned that kelp, they don't have roots, they have these holdfasts. How it makes me wonder, like, how do they grow? What is their life cycle?
Yes. So kelp and algae, but specifically kelp and the canopy formers are some of the fastest growing organisms in the world. So they can grow up to 2 feet per day, which is incredibly quick if you think about it in relation to bamboo or other fast growing species that we think about on land. But they can grow very fast and produce a vast amount of biomass, like a lot of it, right? And again, create this three-dimensional structure that alters their surrounding physical environment. So as they're growing super fast, that typically happens in spring. And so I'm going to refer to kelp maybe as kelp canopies for California, and just how we think about kelp is those canopy forming species. And bull kelp, for example, which is what we have basically north of San Francisco, that organism is an annual, right? And then generally south of San Francisco, we have giant kelp dominated systems, right? And so that is a perennial species. Actually, within the state of California, if you looked at it, we have an annual to the north and a perennial to the south, which kind of changes their life history characteristics and what you would generally see on a year-to-year basis. Let's just focus in on bull kelp, for example, with this annual species. Typically, what you would happen is, let's go with the calendar year. We're in spring right now. And so kelp is in its small little seed stage, and it's now starting to take off. Light is becoming available. The day is getting longer. Upwelling, which means the strong winds are coming, moving that warm water off the top of the ocean, creating that moment for the cool, nutrient-rich water from the deep to rise up. And that's creating like the most enabling, beautiful conditions, hopefully, for kelp to grow. So then what happens is springtime, they're growing. They're like these little lollipop stage. Towards the beginning of summer, they'll start hitting the surface of the ocean. And then once it's summertime, towards the end, like August, September-ish, that's when bull kelp will start creating its reproductive parts, which are sorus, right? Like sori, which is similar to the way that, if you want to think about spores as relation to like fungi, for example. So they'll create these like little spore packets that will adhere to the blades. So like the top of the bull kelp, on those blades that you see, you'll see these milky patches, and those are the spores. That's what is going to create all the little babies. And so those abscess, they release off of the kelp and then sink to the sea floor, typically, hopefully. And then males, females find each other. They spend a little time doing what they do. And then hopefully they'll attach to the sea floor by late fall to begin that cycle again. And so it's this 1-year cycle where you go through this, basically go from seed to reproductive adult, die, senesce, and begin it again. And kelps are also known to create seed banks. So they can also have a delayed growth cycle on year-to-year variations or longer. Very complex, very interesting, but yeah, each system and organism is different as well.
I'm just fascinated by the parallels to plant life on the surface.
Yes.
And when you say the seed bank, for example, any idea how long those seed banks can persist?
Yeah, get this. Small story, but we had that very question, right? So we had experienced kelp loss in the North Coast. And what we saw was basically these places that had kelp strongholds were not actually performing anymore. There was something in the water, temperature, very likely, not urchin this time, but temperature that was inhibiting them from growing. So we're like, is kelp, are seeds even here? And so we did this small study with University of Alabama and Ireland, Galway, who were doing work like this. And we basically went out and collected rocks, brought them back to the lab, scrubbed them to see if there was even kelp on there, on these visibly bare rocks. And yes, there were actually two different species that were able to categorize. So we knew that there was a seed bank, but there was something inhibiting that organism to grow. So to your question about how long these seed banks can last, depends on the species, but we do know from other places in the world, like it could be decades, it could be thousands of years. I think we're still in nascent stages of really understanding the true abilities of these seed banks in marine environments.
So we'll get into some of the conservation challenges that exist more fully. I know that's a good teaser. You say something, maybe
Yeah,
the
sorry,
water
I jumped
temperature.
it.
Oh, no, I want to get there. You also mentioned the cold water upwelling and the nutrient rich water. Help me understand, first of all, why is that cold water, that like deeper cold water, why is it so nutrient rich?
Yeah, so that deeper water is pretty nutrient rich. If you've ever walked the beach and seen like all the algae that washes up, like all that, I don't want to say like dead stuff, but dead stuff that just washes up on the beach, that's only a fraction of how much dead stuff actually happens in the ocean. So a lot of it sinks, and that's typically carbon and other organic materials, right? And so those materials break down in the deep sea and they create nutrients. Those nutrients, in addition to other things like minerals, things like that, those are really like the foundation of where that like nutrients comes from, is the sloughing off of other like organic compounds. And then again, like when you have winds happen and the circulation of the ocean, the tilt of the earth, all these phenomenal processes that we don't really see up here necessarily, these processes are happening, and that warm water sloughs off and gives way to that cool, rich water to rise up and create the enabling conditions really that underwater plants like kelp need to grow, because there are certain nutrients they need to also build their bodies, right? They need certain levels of carbon and nitrogen and these other things to grow.
So it sounds like it's analogous to nutrient cycling on the surface in a way where plants, animals that die, they fall to the soil, they break down, those nutrients become available to the next generation.
That's right.
And then you have all this complexity of the water system and how the upwelling works. The kelp are photosynthesizing as well?
Yeah, kelp, seaweeds are photosynthesizing organisms, really good at it, really efficient at it. And their productivity parallels and actually exceeds most all terrestrial systems, just because of that boom and bust life cycle they have, and also just how the ocean is in itself as a photosynthesis. It's basically a lung, right? Like the ocean is where a lot of our oxygen, most all of our oxygen comes from.
And I've heard it said that kelp are really important organisms for carbon sequestration as well.
Yeah. Ooh, this is like one of those in the kelp world. There are like a few different schools of thought on that. But for me personally, I think about them as temporary carbon storage, or intermediate carbon storage, right? So they are, of course, in the carbon cycle where they're basically utilizing carbon from the seawater. The ocean's a sink, right? And so when we have carbon dioxide, the ocean itself has the ability to take in some of those compounds. And from there, kelp and other seaweeds photosynthesizers can use those materials in their processes. And so they will do that. But then again, they don't have a root system. And so that carbon is locked in their body. And then when they senesce or when they die, that carbon is re-released. And so then it breaks down. And so I think that's why it can go sequester itself in the deep sea, some of it, and then some of it washes up on land. So I think that's why we think about it as like a temporary carbon storage. But nonetheless, thanks for the oxygen, kelp.
Yeah, and I guess all carbon sequestration is temporary depending on the time scale that you're looking at.
Right.
So it's interesting to think about that way. So then it also then makes me wonder, because you hear about, and again, apologies if it feels like I'm jumping all around, but my mind is just going a million miles per hour right now. You hear about ocean acidification and coral bleaching and things like that. Do kelp then in a way help to mediate the acidification?
Of course, that is basically where kelp interacts too, is in that chemical cycle, right? And they, of course, have an impact on helping carbon in a way, and also just create a better environment. And what I say by better environment is, so ocean acidification in itself is part of that chemical cycle too. And so they all interact in a way, right? It's like everything is tied to itself. And so whether you're respiring in the system, like I think of humans, or I think underwater, your invertebrates. There are those that are inhaling and respiring. And then there are others that are doing like kind of the opposite, right? And so your kelps, your photosynthesizers are inadvertently helping buffer all those respirers in the ocean.
Yeah, I guess what I'm envisioning here, like I tend to think in graphs, and I'm seeing these relationships in my head of if the kelp were to suddenly disappear, you would have a lot of carbon released and you would have a more acidic environment as a result, even if temporary. Yeah. And maybe actually that's a transition now into some of the conservation aspects. You said that on the North Coast, something else happened, not the urchins, that caused the kelp to endure pretty dramatic losses. Now, I'm going to flip this on its head for a minute. What do you mean by not the urchins? Because I think I'll leave it at that. What do you mean by not the urchins?
Great question. So kelp can be lost. The threats to kelp are many. Destabilized ecosystems is one, but in this circumstance, it could also be many. There could be many reasons why an ecosystem is not performing or thriving. And so up here, what's interesting is, as a diver, you know these things because you see it with your eyes. But from the surface, when you're looking out and you see kelp, you're like, okay, that's doing fine. When you look out and you don't see kelp, a lot of folks would switch their brains and say, oh, there are urchin under there, like eating the kelp, keeping it from persisting. But if you go diving in some places, kelp is there and urchin are not there. And you can also go somewhere where kelp is not there and urchin are not there, which kind of leads you into this, what else is going on here? And so water temperatures. And so kelp in itself is very nutrient dependent, nutrient and temperature, because temperature and nutrients are linked, especially in ocean systems. And so when we saw the losses that we did, it was not only due to a grazer, it was also due to uninhabitable ocean conditions. The water was frankly too warm and scorching kelp from being able to grow.
Super interesting to me, because the basic story that I had heard, and maybe this is true in some locations, maybe not, please enlighten, but I'd heard a lot about how the system had gone askew in some way, and it had led to a huge increase in urchins. And as you said, they're grazers. And there's been a lot of focus on the urchins preventing the kelp from flourishing. So is the takeaway here that's rarely the case? It's sometimes the case. It's never the case.
It's sometimes the case. Yeah. I think, again, we try to focus in, we find the villain, that villain that's keeping the system down or interacting with it in a negative way. And that is true, but also urchin are native species. And so I'm going to focus in on like purple urchin, because that's the species of the outbreak that we've been seeing. And so purple urchin, for example, they're native species and they are responding when they go into overpopulation. And this is characteristic of urchin all over the world that we've seen. When something happens, like a change in their available food source, like kelp, they eat kelp. And so when you have warming waters that inhibit kelp from growing, it creates this negative feedback loop where urchin change their behavior from basically passive grazers, which means like usually they're hanging out in cracks and crevices in the sea floor, just waiting for drift algae to come to them. When that drift algae is no longer coming to them, you're like, hey, where's my food? And then tie in this, right? Around 2014, we also experienced the loss of a final apex predator in the North Coast specifically, which is the sunflower sea star. So without food, without an apex predator, and we don't have otters up here either, they were extirpated in the mid 1800s along with the fur trade, and they have not yet recolonized this area. When you have the loss of apex predators and then you have warm waters, that is creating a condition where urchin are like, hey, I'm going unchecked. I don't know where my food is. I'm going to go find it. And they did. And so they were responding to what was happening in the ocean. So it's really hard to villainize them because they're native species. They're responding to these like large climactic warming events that were occurring, and then also a disease that took out their top predator.
It sounds a lot like some of the stories you hear about trophic cascades and the famous Yellowstone wolf stories. And in the absence of wolves, the elk and some of the browsers really flourished. And that
Right.
had a negative impact then on maybe the willow trees or some of the vegetation that they eat. So I want to get back to some of the conservation challenges, but maybe talk about restoration, because I'm sitting here thinking, like, how do you recover a system like this that goes askew so dramatically?
Yeah. That's the question, right? And I think that's both an ecological and social question of what do we do to mitigate any more loss? If it's helpful, the backstory here is I was diving at the time and I remember seeing this with my eyes. In 2013, we started to see sea stars wasting. We didn't know at the time what was going on or the extent of it, but we saw specifically the sunflower sea star, which is this huge, beautiful organism with 10 plus arms. It cruises the seafloor super fast and is a great predator.
And how huge is this?
Oh, think about like a hula hoop sometimes, or like a hug. If you went to give someone a hug, like that's
Wow.
how big these animals can get. Very impressive, super fast at cruising the seafloor, and highly effective at eating. And they actually emit like a pheromone almost that like emit this fear response, right? So there are videos of this, and I've seen it, like a sunflower star on the seafloor, just like cruising pretty quick, and everything just moves out of the way, like just gets out of the way because it's just that effective and that fearful. So around that time, sea stars, including sunflower stars, died. We saw over 5 billion, an estimated 5 billion animals die from about like 2013 to 2016 time frame roughly. So this massive loss, and it was not only in California, this was like the whole Eastern Pacific throughout their range. So colleagues in Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, Mexico, like all of it. So that was happening. About a year later, we got this warm blob event. So this like marine heat wave, right? So it was this very deep, very big amorphous body of water that moved onto the Eastern Pacific coast, right? So the west coast of the US and Canada and Mexico, and just stuck there for 2 years. At the 2015, 2016, we also had an El Nino, right? So when we were talking about upwelling, what happens in El Nino is basically the trade winds stop. You get these like warm water events as well. And so all of these things were happening in concert with each other. And we talked about warm water. Kelp stops growing. And then you have these big storm events, right? There's so much going on that kelp was struggling to survive and struggling to grow. Urchin, again, just were like, no predator, no food, I'm coming out. And they moved in these like large batches. So multiple stressors, we're still trying to understand, they're all connected in a way. But when we talk about what we can do to potentially mitigate any more loss, we've lost 96% of kelp canopy in under a decade. That is like unusual and unprecedented in California, and specifically Northern California, Sonoma, Mendocino counties. And the question now is like, what, if anything, can we do to mitigate any more loss and protect and defend that 4% that we have left? And so that's really where myself and there's a large group of folks here in California working to address what we can do.
You stated it earlier, there's a sea star disease that's also at play here.
Yeah, so there is something called sea star wasting disease that was triggered in 2013. And researchers have suggested that it's reduced the global population of sunflower sea stars specifically by an estimated 94%. And so that eventually actually triggered the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, to classify the species as critically endangered. So the sunflower star is now listed as critically endangered, which is definitely helps support also the recovery efforts that are going on right now as well to reestablish that predator.
Is it understood what the causes of the wasting disease are?
That's where we're at right now. There's been a lot of interest and insight to figure out what that is. And the Nature Conservancy has supported the captive breeding program to first, I think when this was all happening, basically make sure that this species doesn't go extinct. So Friday Harbor Labs, Jason Hoden up in Washington, pioneered the first captive breeding program just to keep those species going. And then from those programs, there have also been a deep dive into what is the causative agent of disease. And we're not quite there yet, but some were thinking adenza virus, that we're not sure anymore. So we do very much, when we say disease, we very much do need to understand still the epidemiology of what caused this and what's continuing to cause it, because it's not over yet. We still see stars out in the wild wasting, but we also see healthy ones.
Is there any indication that maybe those healthy ones are like genetically predisposed to be able to fight off whatever this is? I guess this is a loaded question, because if the epidemiology is still unclear, it's probably hard to draw those conclusions.
Yeah, that's the question. I think in a similar way that when we lost 96% of kelp, 4% remaining, we're like, what's up with you 4%? Like, why did you survive? What was your enabling condition? Is it you or was it the place? So I think there's a lot of like question around that. And I think that's especially true for sunflower stars too, but they must have some resistance to that disease that prevented them from wasting, or they were isolated enough that it never made it to them. And there were some pockets of sunflower star populations found during the disease time, the deep fjords of BC and other places. So it does make you wonder that very question.
And are the captive breeding programs, are they successful so far?
Yes. When I think about like recovery actions, I think of them in two ways. One is through reestablishment of natural predators, right? Because the ecosystem itself cannot persist in this imbalanced state. It needs to have some level of top trophic predator for it to function in a way that is sustainably healthy. Humans can't do that. We can't emit fear as much as we want to. We can't emit fear the way a sunflower star does. So nothing replaces that. But in that same vein, there are some other human mitigated tactics that we can do and start exploring to get in the water and again, prevent any more loss from happening.
What are some of those tactics?
Yeah, so that is where I focus a lot of time. But globally, apex predators working hard to make sure that they're enabled to get back in the wild. That's one. But then in terms of human activities, I think of it as like grazer suppression. If you have a grazer, overabundance of grazers like we do, purple urchin. And then there's also kelp enhancement, which is really focused on catalyzing vegetative recovery. Think of it as like seeding the seafloor. So for example, in Northern California, we've done restoration where you basically have to go underwater, look at the system, and prescribe a treatment. You don't know what kind of restoration that needs to be done until you physically touch the earth in a way and try to understand. And I think another important caveat here too is we're very much in the learning stages. I think right now, everything that we're doing is experimental with the keen eye that we do not want to hurt the system. We want to help the system. And when we go and when I'm talking about restoration right now, I'm really talking about these experiments that we're doing at these scales that'll tell us whether we should proceed or whether we should halt the brakes. And so that's like an ecological answer, but then also a social one, because some of what we do needs that social uptake. Would you like me to dig into like the specifics of what kinds of restoration?
Yeah, I'd love to hear like what are some of the experiments that you're working on right now, and how do you contain them so that they don't, since it is, as you said, an experiment, how do you contain it so that it doesn't cause too much harm, but it's still large enough scale to be indicative of something that might work?
In the first year, we started, I would say, organized restoration that I became involved in 2020. And so at this time, mind you, when we talked about we've been focused on the ecology here, we haven't really talked about the human dimension much. But with the loss of kelp, we also lost a abalone fishery, right? We had the last recreational abalone fishery in California was up here in Northern California. With the loss of kelp, abalone were pushed into the shallow environment, outcompeted, and died. And so, the folks who were participating in that recreational fishery were not feeling great. And they're also with abalone, there's a deep cultural and spiritual connection by many to abalone as well. Just acknowledging that is like the back base here of what we're doing here and why we're doing it. In addition, red urchin were outcompeted similar to abalone. So the red urchin industry that we have up here was also negatively impacted. That fleet actually filed for federal fishery disaster. This was happening 2014 to 19. And by 2020, we knew that this was not going to fix itself, quote unquote. I think at the time, there was a lot of conversation around, do we intervene or let the system do what it does? But looking globally, we know that urchin can persist in a barren state. So urchin can create these barrens that can persist for decades and decades, like 70 plus years. We've seen them do this in Japan. And Same thing in the Aleutian Archipelago. So we know that they can persist. The question then was, if we know that now, what can we do to protect that 4%? We mobilized a commercial diver fleet. We got state support. The state of California was like, this is not going away. Let's start understanding what we can do to mitigate. We received funds from the Ocean Protection Council to get in and test this very first soft toss question, which was, can commercial urchin divers systematically remove purple urchin, harvest them? And if so, what happens? What are the consequences of that? Do we get kelp recovery? What does it look like logistically, cost-wise, all that? None of that had been done in a bull kelp system in California. So that's what we set out to do. And we found that they can reduce that density on the seafloor. And we do see some kelp recovery, but we did not see a sustained big kelp forest. And so that tipped our line to our next set of questioning is, how can we catalyze vegetative recovery? And so that spun up our kelp enhancement work as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then I keep thinking in the back of my head about the blob that you talked about and the warming oceans. And that was a unique event, but it's also has a backdrop of just general oceanic warming.
That's right.
I'm curious,
That's right.
What are your thoughts there in the face of warming oceans? I don't want to be overly dramatic, but is this just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to being able to sustain and restore the kelp forests?
Absolutely. It's not a question of if the next marine heat waves happens, it's when it happens. And I think what we're all trying to do right now is, again, we're not trying to restore 350-kilometer coastline that lost its kelp. What we're trying to do is create refugia, resilient refugia in these oases that showed signs of being able to persist through the previous marine heat waves. And they're a beacon of hope almost, that what can we do to protect and defend those refugia areas and basically create a network that organisms can sink into and just still support that rich biodiversity that kelp forests can have. And so I think that's really like that's our North Star right now, is, again, just like really focusing in on those critical habitat areas that showed signs of success, understanding why they persisted, and then trying to leverage that into our recovery strategies.
Are there people looking at that 4% of kelp did sustain and looking at it like from a DNA perspective and trying to get to the bottom of what's different? You mentioned maybe it's just because some of these other factors didn't reach those populations. But I'm curious, there's so much work going on in the world of genomics and DNA, if that's something that there's even funding for or capability to do.
We've done quite a bit of research to understand that. It's like, why are these locations persisting? And I will, as a backdrop, also say, like, all of our recovery strategies are focused around expanding those kelp patches. For example, we have 3 locations we work at up here in Mendocino. All of those were places where we saw some kelp survive those heat waves. And so we're like, okay, let's focus in on here and think about what is possibly keeping it there. And so again, the genetic part, we do know bull kelp is relatively similar to each other genetically, which isn't incredibly surprising, but it does tell us something about their population dynamics. Again, they're an annual species, but very importantly, what we saw was a lot of the kelp patches that persisted were close to shore, up near a beach, and near a freshwater confluence. And fresh water is actually the one Achilles heel for urchin. They don't like fresh water. I can't help but bring up also, during this time, we were in a severe drought in California, right? These land and sea connections cannot be understated. We were in a severe drought, which could have created the conditions of a more like saline environment that enabled urchin to move into places that they don't usually go into. That's a theory. But again, I think there are a lot of characteristics of what makes these kelp refugia so great, but finding out exactly what it is underwater is very challenging. And so what we do now is just try to, again, relieve any grazing pressure, protect that patch, basically create a buffer around it, and then hope that there's spillover effect from that forest of release of spore. And we just can keep growing those patches to, again, create some defensible space.
Got it. Yeah, definitely. I can see all the layers here from sustaining and growing the refugia to trying to help the kelp reestablish where there is no refugia. And I guess another layer, you mentioned the drought and the confluence of rivers coming from land. And I was thinking about how one of the impacts to fish in the rivers was the fact that during the drought, and also because so much water is retained and held upstream in reservoirs, that the temperatures of the rivers have risen quite a bit as well. There's less water flow and everything else that's going on. Is that yet another variable that is on your radar from like the kelp ecology standpoint? Is like how much water is flowing in, not just from a salinity standpoint, but from creating little patches of, I don't know if it's cooler water or warmer water or what it would be, but is there anything there?
Absolutely. I think Western science really tries to focus in on these ecosystems, and it's almost like we think about them in isolation, right? And there's no way, what happens upstream does not impact what happens downstream, right? Like where all these rivers output that's in California, they're going into kelp forest ecosystems. So of course there's interaction between freshwater, saltwater. And then to that point, you brought up about temperature. Think about this too, with all the fires we've been having. Think about the turbidity and how many tannins and just like other ash, just all of this stuff that deposits into the ocean that just changes the light structure, the turbidity of the water. And that light is exactly what is needed at the seafloor to kick off kelp to grow. What we do on land does not happen in isolation. It absolutely impacts what happens in our oceans as well.
Wow. I'm feeling a little down now thinking about this, because it's like, in a way, we could be looking at 100 things that are like 5% worse than they were 50 years ago. And that's accumulation of all of these changes is enough to push it over the edge. So where do you find hope in moving forward in this space?
Yeah. Where I find hope is looking at the success stories globally. We know it's achievable. We know that with the right support from governance and acknowledgement of key ecosystems, recovery can happen. And I'm thinking specifically around Korea, for example. They've restored tens of thousands of hectares of kelp forests because they have substantial government buy-in. It's how they do business. They value their kelp forest systems, right? They have kelp forests as well. They have certain value systems that enable the spend, the attention, the acknowledgement of this key ecosystem. And they've gone all in to invest in it. And while you're like, ooh, what does that look like? What it actually looks like is when you invest millions, you get back billions, right? That's the kind of, I think, thinking that needs to be reshaped. And I'm seeing some of that. Like we're seeing that energy happening right now in terms of infrastructure dollars that are coming online, in terms of habitat recovery. But I find success in seeing what's being done globally and what we can possibly pull on here.
I guess what I will ask you is, what can regular people, like listeners here or others, I don't know who, do to help?
So if you're a diver, if you're interested in going diving, there are great programs like Reef Check that train community or citizen scientist divers to go and monitor kelp in California. And they do it all over the world. They're a lovely organization. You can also get in touch with folks like myself and Greater Farallons and other, I'm thinking about the Bay Foundation on South, those that are doing kelp recovery efforts here in California. They're always looking for interdisciplinary volunteers, right? Or basically contributing what kind of work you do into that space, because often you need that interdisciplinary approach to really get at how we do restoration. Lastly, I would just say paying attention, right? And I say that in a way that's lofty, but really acknowledging that if you live in California or a place with cold water, what is in your ocean is a kelp forest. And it is so important for the very reasons that we like live and breathe. And I can't like overstate that, which means these forest systems mean fish for us. They mean the beautiful mammals that we see. They are these billion dollar ecosystems, if you wanted to put like a dollar amount on them, but they're also culturally just so important for the coast of California. So just acknowledging of like the place that you live, and that we spend a certain amount for terrestrial systems in restoration, but tiny amounts of that into marine system restoration. And that disparity, I think, is definitely inhibiting our growth in this space.
Yeah, I heard some really interesting statistics. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I think a lot of people recognize that the ocean is 70% of the surface of the earth, but then it goes so much literally deeper than that, because when you think about how life persists throughout so much of the depth of the ocean. The ocean is supporting so much more life across such a wider variety of space. It really is. I guess it's just because we can't see down in there and we don't spend time down in those environments unless you're a diver. And even then limited to a small subset still. So definitely disproportionate in our mindset and in our spending.
That's right. And then even taking that step back, when we were talking about how extensive kelp is all over the world, it covers a third of the world's coastline, right? That's a big proportion. And we have 750 million people live within a 60-kilometer radius of the coastline. It's millions and millions of people are actually like just adjacent to kelp forests, rely on them for everything. We build our lives around them and with them. And this is not only impacting California, the losses that we've been talking about, but it's a global movement. With UN Decade of Change, we just launched the Kelp Forest Challenge through the Kelp Forest Alliance, which is set a global target to protect and restore 4 million hectares of forests in the next 20 years or so. And those sorts of movements and acknowledgement from the international space is also enabling California and the United States and other places to like mobilize alongside others and learn from each other and just move this space along a lot quicker.
Yeah. And I also think about in the bigger picture, even if you don't live in one of those areas, I grew up in Nebraska, about as far away from an ocean as you can possibly be, but the oceans still affect people in Nebraska for some of the reasons we talked about today. Hopefully we can all be part of this movement and give more support to healthy oceans in all aspects of what health means for them. This has really been eye-opening for me. And as we were talking about so many different interconnected parts, which is part of the fun of these discussions, because it really does help open my eyes anyway, and hopefully people listening, their eyes too. But before we wrap up, what else can we do? What would you recommend? What have you found to be effective in moving people up a rung in environmental awareness?
Getting them involved. I think when we talk about environmental awareness, it's one thing for those who are doing some level of interaction with the environment or trying to remediate it. As a kelp practitioner or as a diver, I see it and I do it. It's underwater. It's really out of sight and out of mind for a lot of people. So what I've found to be moving the space forward is to specifically invest in things that are going to get people to experience what I have the great privilege of being able to experience. So at a very face level, it's like being able to support art and science communication to help paint the picture and help make people feel something so they do something, right? And so there's that human element and connection of people to place that we had talked about the above below video. That was actually like the very impetus. There was this desire for a poetic almost description of what a kelp forest was, painting this like beautiful picture and then feeling the quick loss of what that looks like, and doing that in a way that painted a picture of what can be done and showing hope as well. So I think, again, it's finding those alternate avenues and investing in like professional artists and professional science communicators to come and work in tandem with scientists to create events and also create training programs and state-supported training programs for more diverse workforce, people who don't usually get to dive, get them in the water to do it. So it's really just, again, creating space for more people, a more diverse type of thinker to get in the water and really just help us out. I think we need that creativity and that diversity of thought to really unhinge this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obvious that you have your hands full. Do you have any specific projects, anything upcoming that you'd like to highlight for listeners?
I do, actually. We found out about a couple months ago that we were awarded around $1.5 million to do. It's basically accelerating bull kelp recovery and basically scaling a lot of what we've been testing in these small silos, right? We talked about testing grazer suppression, testing kelp enhancement, like doing all these things in silo. And then we didn't even talk about finding like markets for urchin. That's like a whole other thing that we're doing. And so we're trying to close the loop here, trying to make it so that what we do is supporting climate readiness for coastal communities. And so we were awarded funding to basically deploy a strategic sequence of restoration techniques at a site that just tipped over into being an urchin barren. And so we're going to start that work. So it's a fresh urchin barren And we're hoping that we're catching it at a time that we can remediate it quickly in this pyrophagia location. But we're about to start that work this spring of 2024. We're excited about it. So in a couple years, definitely stay tuned on how we're doing. But of importance, we're also doing these community events as part of this work. Kelp Fest is one of them. And it's really trying to bring people together to like really create this cultural deep connection to the ecosystem as we're trying to restore it. So it's like bringing the community along for the ride, and I'm excited about it.
That's great. And if people want to follow along on those big projects or just some of the day-to-day or whatever, where can people go? Are you on social media? Is there a website? What do you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. Feel free to shoot me an email. And if I'm not the person, I did also speak on behalf of a lot of people I work with in this really rich level of thinkers. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can find me at Tristin, my first name, .McHugh at TNC as in the natureconservancy.org.
Great. I'll be sure to include that in the show notes. And before we call it a day, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
I just want to thank you for this opportunity. I know kelp is not necessarily the sexiest or most exciting organism on the planet. I think it is, but I'm biased. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity to kind of share the story. And yeah, there's more to it we didn't even get to. So if there's ever any interest, I'm happy to continue the conversation or suggest another kelp-minded thinker on this podcast.
Well, I might take you up on that offer. I think there's a lot more that we could go into here. So thank you so much for making the time today. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I appreciate you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And likewise, I really appreciate this podcast and just creating the space to be curious. Thank you.
And just one more thing. Thanks to Jumpstart Nature volunteer Erica Zader for editing help this episode. Thanks for sticking through the entire episode. If you made it this far, I hope that it means that you enjoyed it. If so, please spread the word and share this episode with 3 friends or groups that you think would enjoy it too. As for today's episode, let me know. Did I miss anything? Was there a topic I should have covered? Let me know at podcast@jumpstartnature.com or DM me on any of my social accounts. I'll do my best to answer your questions. You can find me at Nature's Archive, one word, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I also share photography, nature stories, and much more on those accounts, so you can follow just to stay in touch, too. And despite being called crazy by numerous friends and colleagues, last year I left my tech career behind to start Jumpstart Nature, which Nature's Archive is now part of. For the sake of myself, my family, and the planet, I need to make this work, so please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/jumpstartnature. I offer some exclusive content and perks, and you can start donations as low as $4 a month. Lastly, please also check out our latest creation. It's the Jumpstart Nature podcast. We just completed our pilot season, where each episode reveals an unseen, surprising, or misunderstood nature topic with the help of experts and our host, Griff Griffith. It's entertaining and inspiring, and even reached number 3 on the Apple Nature podcast charts. There's much more on our roadmap, but we need your support, so check out jumpstartnature.com for more details. Thank you.